good to see you, Zach. Appropriate email thread from this morning. Just talking about sort of some of the things, a particular property that I think it was, all I saw was it was a new ADU in a refi was valued by the appraiser at 20 grand.
It's pretty horrifying.
Yeah, so my own case, I have an ADU, detached ADU, and we had it appraised for a refi. It was built cash. We had it appraised for a refi about 18 months ago. The first appraisal as a single family home with a guest house was $350. But as a duplex, it was worth $450. So these kinds of stories are common. Thanks very much. These kinds of stories are common. I think Martin had a similar experience with his ADU, this one this morning, the one Dakota was just talking about. The same thing. And I'm going to try to explain why that happens, or why that can happen. First is describing how appraisals work. What is it? It's really important to know that an appraisal is an opinion of value, and opinions vary. So you can send the same appraiser out to appraise, or you can send 5 different appraisers out to appraise the same property and end up with a range of differing opinions of value. But the whole appraisal process is supposed to limit the variation in the final opinions. The problem, or one of the reasons you end up with these huge ranges, is because properties with ADUs are not typical. They're atypical. And if the data on which appraisers are relying to reach a reasonable opinion of value vary widely, the results are going to vary. Okay, that's the primary reason. Now, besides being an opinion, the 3 typical ways appraisers arrive at these opinions are the sales comparison approach to value, which you're all familiar with when Dakota was mentioning comparables or comps or things. That's the most common. The cost approach is another, and income approach is the third. So this is not an appraisal class, but I just want to get you sort of on board with what my world is and how it applies to ADUs. So you can talk more reasonably and knowledgeably with people when you're trying to get financing on these places. So the sales comparison approach is the most common in residential appraising. Okay, you mentioned MAIs. Those are typically, it's a designation for a commercial or a general appraiser. SRA would be the designation from the same group for residential appraisers. Residential appraisers, only up to 4 units. That's it. That's all I appraise. So duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes are the only income-producing properties I have any experience with. Having done this in Portland for about 22 years now, I can say all of the work I do, probably only 5% of it is 2, 3, or 4 unit properties. Okay, and I think that's pretty common. So even a typical duplex, triplex, or fourplex is a very small part of the work I do anyway. So now you're asking me to understand a unique sort of property that's going to take the typical appraiser time to learn about. Their fee is typically not going to increase, and should they really even spend the extra time when it's such a small part of their practice anyway? So that's just one of the problems you might run into. Other than that, when you see the property of the ADU like Kohl's, what's comparable to it? I'm going around trying to use these established appraisal methods, and there's nothing like it around. Now, there are more ADUs around now than there used to be, but it's not just the number of ADUs that are properties with ADUs that are out there. They have to have sold recently for me to have any idea that they're out there or be able to peg a market-related value to it. Okay? So, very small part of the market. And just think how many have sold in the last 90 days that I can actually use in the appraisal in a way that an underwriter will accept. Okay, so there are basic principles for appraisal, but all the callbacks I get from lenders that I've had over the last 20 years are not related to the appraisal process, but related to lender guidelines for what is acceptable. Okay, I can do an appraisal and feel confident in it, but that doesn't mean the lender will still want to lend on it, okay? So finding comparables and determining what actually is comparable to a property with an ADU is a problem, okay? Now the cost approach to value is also, used by appraisers. Can anyone in here tell me what the relationship of cost to value is? I'm moving around too much?
No, whatever.
What's the relationship of cost to value? Yes?
Replacement cost.
Okay, replacement cost. There's reproduction cost and replacement cost that appraisers use. Here's the answer. Cost can be less than value, the same as value, or more than value. This is very important to builders out here. You know it intuitively. Just because you put 20 grand into your house doesn't mean your house is worth 20 grand more tomorrow. Okay, so, and what happens if I put 200 grand into a property, or I build a property for 200 grand and someone gives me 100 for it tomorrow? Is it worth 200 or is it worth 100? It's probably closer to 100 because that's what somebody just paid me for it. The difference between the 200 I put into it and the 100 that someone's paying me is called obsolescence. That's called overbuilding. Okay, and it doesn't occur only in green properties or high performance properties. It occurs in custom building all the time. It's just a principle. So know that the cost approach to value I will develop for the property. But the cost approach to value might not be what the market value for the property is. But I will develop it anyway. And I think, and this is basically what these guys were referring to a little bit earlier. And what sources am I going to use as an appraiser to adequately cost the value or the construction cost of the ADU? Where am I going to get that? Is it going to be a traditional source that appraisers use? Probably not, because there aren't a lot of sources out there for 400 to 900 square foot homes. They're atypical. And this goes to what Dakota was just mentioning. If you're building one and an appraiser's coming out there and you have hard costs, because hard costs are like you were speaking to, or what appraisers are really going to use, the soft cost, the financing cost, the time cost of money, all those things. I'm dealing with hard costs. If you have the costs for that, is that going to influence my opinion of the property? It will influence it. It doesn't mean I'm going to say you put 100 into it, I think it's worth 100 at the end, but the cost will, there is a relationship of cost to value. But that's not the end all for it, but yes, it will influence it. Because if I don't know anything about ADUs and I go in and look at the construction, I say, well, this looks like average quality $75 a square foot construction. But if it actually cost $105 to do it, it will cause me to reconsider my approach to the property. Okay, so I always said the more information you can give the appraiser, the better. Whether they listen to you or not, or they seem like they're listening to you or not, the more information, the better. Their job, essentially, is analyzing as much data related to the market as possible. Okay? Finally, though, is the income approach to value. It's rarely used in residential appraising. Okay, remember, I just said about 5% of the jobs I've done over the last 20 plus years have been income producing properties. So I don't use it very often. And hang on just a second. And as applies to ADUs, if I don't know a lot about ADUs locally, I'm not even going to consider using the income approach to value. If I never seen them, I don't know what the legal uses are for the property. If the owner doesn't know and I'm not being told by the lender or the broker, this is the type of property and the things I need to consider doing it, it might be completely over my head. And in your case, where two appraisers said, I don't know anything about it and I'm not going to appraise it, that's actually a good sign. That means they were getting the messages through that pipeline that this is a unique kind of property. If it's a unique kind of property, you need to be willing to pay the appraiser more. You're willing to pay the builder more. The broker's going to make the same amount of commission on the property. The appraiser is going to do extra work. If you're going to require them to do extra work, you got to be willing to pay for it. Okay, a single family appraisal is like $400, $450 locally. A duplex is in the $700 range. It's like an extra $200 to $300 for you to get a much more accurate valuation. So I just encourage you to just pay the fee because that's actually more commensurate with the additional work that the appraisal will take. Okay, what is the whole theory of the income approach is if it can rent for more, shouldn't it be worth more? Yeah, the nicer apartments rent for more than chromier apartments. Yes. The whole idea is I have two theoretical income streams for this property. In Portland, it's critical. You can rent both units. In most markets, I think there was a gal here from Seattle, in the markets we looked at in Santa Cruz, in Boston, in other places you can only rent one unit. So the income approach isn't going to help you as much. You only have one rentable unit, but Portland is unique. You can rent both. But, as Martin pointed out in the beginning, they're in single family zones. So remember, as an appraiser who doesn't have a lot of experience with these, the assumption off the bat is that it is an illegal use, right? And therefore, if I even mention it in the appraisal, or if the lender thinks if they mention it that you won't get a loan, period, okay? So I can rent both units, so I have two income streams going into the future. The whole purpose of this approach is capitalizing both those at a value today, okay? And that the rental income from a property, like I just said, has a relationship to its market value, all right? And if I have two income streams for a property, it's typically worth more than if there's only one. So what we found in looking at a bunch of properties with ADUs that have sold is that when they were valued using standard appraisal techniques for the income approach was typically, it was around 7 to 9% higher on average. But then we looked at these properties and said, well, if they're actually selling for 7 to 9% lower than what the income is showing for these properties, where's the disconnect? Why aren't they closer? And what do you think? Why does it seem to be worth a little bit more from the income approach than what somebody actually forked out for that property? Any guesses?
It's not a typical thing. I mean, it's, as a consumer, you have to be willing to dive in there, and you may not.
You do.
Be ready.
And it's the people representing those properties that sold on the open market, the buyers, the sellers, the brokers, everybody is misinformed about the legal uses for ADUs locally. But it's changing, and you can see that from the number of these units being built, the number of them that are getting financing, all the press around them. I've seen a huge change just in the last year on these. Now, it leads to requiring several things doing the income approach. Everybody needs to understand the legal uses of the ADU, and it has to be a legal ADU. 2 weeks ago, I looked at a property. Beautiful little cottage with fully renovated and a matching renovated detached garage that had been changed into an apartment. When I looked at permits for the place, no permits on anything. So I can't, I could appraise